Egyptian pharaohs didn't browse for brides, they looked to their own sisters. For over 3,000 years, the rulers of the most advanced civilization on Earth practiced sibling marriage with chilling regularity. This wasn't about depravity or genetic ignorance. It was about something far more calculated, maintaining divine bloodlines and absolute power. What you're about to learn reveals how ancient Egypt's royal family kept their divinity in the family, literally. Welcome to another exploration of how love and power intertwined throughout history. Take a moment to get comfortable, maybe dim the lights, settle into your favorite spot. If you enjoy these bedtime stories from the past, consider subscribing to join our community of history lovers, and drop a comment, letting us know where you're listening from tonight and what time it is in your part of the world. Now, let's descend into ancient Egypt together. A shocking revelation. Tonight, we're entering the opulent, calculated world of ancient Egyptian royal marriages, spanning from roughly 3000 BCE to 30 BCE, 3 millennia of a practice that seems incomprehensible to modern sensibilities. The pharaohs weren't choosing wives the way other rulers did. They were solving a theological problem: how to preserve the divine essence that made them living gods. The answer? Keep the blood pure by marrying within the family. A shocking revelation. Ancient Egypt operated under a radically different worldview than surrounding civilizations. The pharaoh wasn't just a king, he was a living god, the earthly embodiment of Horus, son of Osiris and Isis. This wasn't metaphorical. Egyptians genuinely believed their ruler was divine, maintaining cosmic order and balance through their very existence. This created a unique problem. If the pharaoh was divine, how could he marry a mere mortal without diluting his godhood? A shocking revelation. The answer lay in Egyptian mythology itself. The gods frequently married their siblings. Osiris married his sister Isis. Set married his sister Nephthys. If the gods did it, pharaohs, as gods themselves, should follow the same pattern. Egyptian society had complex views on family structure that differed significantly from later Western norms. The royal family existed in a category completely separate from common Egyptians. They weren't bound by the same rules because they weren't the same species, metaphysically speaking. A shocking revelation. The selection process for a great royal wife, the pharaoh's primary queen, was determined by bloodline above all else. The ideal candidate was the pharaoh's full sister, born to the previous pharaoh and his great royal wife. This created the purest possible continuation of divine blood. If no full sister was available, a half-sister would suffice. If no sisters existed, the pharaoh might marry a cousin, though this was considered less ideal. A shocking revelation. Evidence from the 18th dynasty shows this pattern repeatedly. Ahmose I married his sister Ahmose Nefertari. Their son Amenhotep I likely married his sister Ahmose Meritamun. Thutmose I married his sister Ahmose. This wasn't occasional, it was standard operating procedure for maintaining divine legitimacy. DNA analysis of royal mummies has confirmed that many pharaohs were indeed products of sibling marriages, showing genetic markers consistent with close inbreeding. A shocking revelation. The most famous example is Tutankhamun, whose parents were likely full siblings, confirmed through DNA testing in 2010. His own wife, Ankhesenamun, was his half-sister. The genetic consequences were severe. Tutankhamun had a club foot, a cleft palate, and likely suffered from multiple genetic disorders that contributed to his early death around age 19. Yet even knowing the physical consequences, they continued the practice because theological concerns outweighed medical ones. A shocking revelation. But here's where it gets more complex. Pharaohs maintained extensive harems of secondary wives, concubines, and foreign princesses received through diplomatic marriages. Ramesses II had 8 principal wives and numerous concubines, fathering over 100 children. These secondary marriages served political purposes, cementing alliances with foreign powers or important noble families. However, the great royal wife, the woman whose son would ideally inherit the throne, was almost always a close blood relative. A shocking revelation. Women's perspectives on this system are partially preserved in tomb paintings, inscriptions, and letters. Hatshepsut, one of the few female pharaohs, married her half-brother Thutmose II, but after his death, she seized power herself, rather than serving as regent for his son. Her inscriptions emphasize her divine birth. Her mother Ahmose was supposedly impregnated by the god Amun himself, using the same theological logic that justified sibling marriage to justify her rule. A shocking revelation. The practice wasn't without critics, even in ancient times. Some argue that not all supposed sibling marriages were biological, sisters could be an honorific term for wife in some contexts, and royal propaganda may have exaggerated blood relationships to enhance legitimacy. However, DNA evidence from royal mummies increasingly confirms that at least some of these marriages were literally between siblings. The genetic evidence doesn't lie. These unions were real and biologically devastating. A shocking revelation. Non-royal Egyptians viewed royal sibling marriage with a mixture of reverence and acceptance. It was part of what made pharaohs divine and separate. Common people didn't emulate it, understanding it as something gods did, not humans. When foreign rulers learned of this practice, reactions were mixed. Hittite kings found Egyptian customs strange but diplomatically acceptable. The Greeks, after Alexander's conquest of Egypt, were horrified. They considered sibling marriage barbaric incest, a shocking revelation. This cultural clash led the Ptolemaic dynasty, Macedonian Greeks ruling Egypt, to initially avoid sibling marriage. But by Cleopatra's time they'd adopted it fully. Cleopatra VII married both her younger brothers, Ptolemy XIII and Ptolemy XIV, though she likely had them both killed and never consummated these marriages. She was using Egyptian custom for political legitimacy, while maintaining Greek sensibilities in practice, a calculated performance of divine tradition, a shocking revelation. The logistics of these marriages were carefully managed. The wedding ceremony itself was a religious rite that emphasized divine continuity rather than romantic union. Inscriptions describe elaborate rituals where the new great royal wife received divine titles and was associated with goddess Hathor, wife of Horus. The marriage legitimized the pharaoh's rule and, crucially, legitimized the children who would continue the divine dynasty. Romantic love wasn't expected or required. This was about cosmic order, a shocking revelation. Egyptian royal sibling marriage represents one of history's most extreme examples of ideology trumping biological consequences. For 3,000 years, they prioritized theological purity over genetic health, creating a system where power and divinity were inseparable from bloodline. This had profound effects on Egyptian political stability. Succession crises were common because the genetic effects of inbreeding often produced sickly heirs who died young, leading to disputed claims and dynastic instability. A shocking revelation. As you drift towards sleep tonight, consider the power of belief systems to override even basic biological instincts. Egyptians knew that close relatives marrying produced weaker children. The evidence was in the palace nurseries. Yet they continued because preserving divine bloodline mattered more than individual health. Their pharaohs weren't choosing wives. They were performing theological duties, maintaining cosmic order through calculated family arrangements. In their minds, the fate of the universe depended on keeping godhood in the family. Picture this. You're a living god walking among mortals, your very existence maintaining cosmic balance. But there's a problem. If you marry someone ordinary, someone merely human, wouldn't that dilute your divine essence? This was the theological puzzle that shaped 3,000 years of Egyptian royal marriages. To understand why pharaohs married their sisters, we need to enter their sacred worldview. For them, this wasn't about family dynamics. It was about preserving the divine spark that held the universe together. Ancient Egyptians believed their pharaoh wasn't just a king who happened to rule. He was literally a god in human form, the earthly embodiment of Horus, son of Osiris and Isis. This wasn't symbolic or metaphorical thinking. When they looked at their pharaoh, they saw divinity walking their streets, breathing their air. This created a unique problem other civilizations never faced. How do you preserve divine bloodline when mixing it with mortal blood threatens to weaken or destroy it entirely? The answer lay in Egyptian mythology itself. Their gods had shown them the way forward through their own marriages and relationships. Osiris, lord of the underworld and judge of the dead, married his sister Isis. Seta, the god of chaos and the desert, married his sister Nephthys. These weren't scandalous stories whispered in temple corners. They were foundational myths, sacred truths that explained how divine beings maintained their power and purity across generations. If the gods practiced sibling marriage to preserve their divine essence, then pharaohs, as living gods, should follow the same divine pattern. This wasn't innovation, it was imitation of celestial order. The royal family existed in a completely separate category from common Egyptians. They weren't bound by the same rules because they weren't the same species, metaphysically speaking. They were divine beings temporarily housed in human bodies, maintaining cosmic balance through their very existence. The concept of Mate, cosmic order and balance, was central to Egyptian thinking. Everything in the universe had its proper place, its correct relationship to everything else. The pharaoh's marriage wasn't a personal choice or romantic decision. It was a cosmic duty, a sacred responsibility to maintain divine order. Marrying outside the bloodline risked disrupting this balance, potentially causing chaos that could affect the Nile's flooding, the harvest, even the movement of the stars. The great royal wife, the pharaoh's primary queen, had to be chosen with divine bloodline as the top priority. The ideal candidate was the pharaoh's full sister, born to the previous pharaoh and his own great royal wife. This created the purest possible continuation of divine essence. If no full sister existed, a half-sister would work. Cousins were acceptable but less ideal. Each step away from pure sibling marriage required more elaborate theological justifications. Common Egyptians occasionally married cousins or other relatives, but full sibling marriage was largely reserved for royalty. This practice reinforced the fundamental difference between pharaohs and their subjects. Regular people understood this as something gods did, not humans. They viewed royal sibling marriage with reverence and acceptance. It was part of what made pharaohs divine and separate from ordinary mortals. It wasn't meant to be copied by regular families. The wedding ceremony itself emphasized divine continuity rather than romantic union. These weren't celebrations of love. They were religious rites confirming cosmic order. The new great royal wife received divine titles and became associated with goddess Hathor, wife of Horus. Every aspect of the ritual reinforced the theological necessity of the marriage. Personal feelings weren't considered relevant. This was about maintaining the divine spark that kept Egypt functioning properly. Evidence from tombs and inscriptions shows this pattern repeating across dynasties. Pharaohs understood the theological stakes perfectly. A physically imperfect but divinely pure ruler was preferable to a healthy but theologically compromised one. The genetic consequences were visible. Royal children often suffered from deformities and health problems, but theological concerns always outweighed medical ones. Divine legitimacy mattered more than individual wellness or genetic diversity. This created a fascinating two-tier marriage system. Pharaohs maintained extensive harems of secondary wives, concubines, and foreign princesses received through diplomatic marriages. These served political purposes, cementing alliances, securing trade routes, preventing wars, but the great royal wife, the woman whose son would inherit divine kingship, was almost always a close blood relative. Sacred marriages within the family for divine legitimacy, practical marriages outside it for politics. Women within this system had complex relationships with their circumstances. Some, like Hatshepsut, understood the power dynamics perfectly and used theological logic to justify their own rule. She emphasized her divine birth, her mother supposedly impregnated by the god Amun himself, using the same bloodline arguments that justified sibling marriage to claim pharaonic authority. Divine bloodline was everything in Egyptian politics, and she knew how to wield it. The practice wasn't without complexities even within Egyptian culture. Some scholars argue that not all supposed sibling marriages were biological, that sister could be an honorific term for wife in certain contexts. Royal propaganda may have exaggerated blood relationships to enhance legitimacy claims. However, DNA evidence from royal mummies increasingly confirms that at least some of these marriages were literally between siblings. The genetic markers don't lie about close inbreeding. Foreign rulers had mixed reactions when they learned of Egyptian customs. Hittite kings found it strange but diplomatically acceptable. The Greeks, after Alexander's conquest, were horrified. They considered sibling marriage barbaric incest. This cultural clash created interesting adaptations. The Ptolemaic dynasty initially avoided sibling marriage, but eventually adopted it fully. By Cleopatra's time, they used Egyptian customs for political legitimacy, while maintaining Greek sensibilities in private. The logistics required careful management across generations. Royal bloodlines had to be tracked meticulously, suitable marriage partners identified early. Theological justifications prepared for unusual circumstances. Palace officials maintained detailed genealogies to ensure proper divine succession. Every royal birth was examined not just for health and gender, but for theological implications. Which children carried the purest divine essence? Who would be suitable marriage partners for future pharaohs? This system created profound political instability over centuries. The genetic effects of inbreeding often produced sickly heirs who died young, leading to succession crises and disputed claims. Yet Egyptians never abandoned the practice, suggesting how powerfully their religious worldview shaped practical decisions. They prioritized theological purity over genetic health for 3,000 years, one of history's most extreme examples of ideology overriding biological consequences. Understanding this theological foundation helps explain the calculated nature of royal Egyptian marriages. These weren't choices driven by desire or political convenience. They were cosmic duties, sacred responsibilities to maintain universal order. The pharaoh's marriage was about preserving divine essence, ensuring proper succession, keeping the gods happy and the universe balanced. For ancient Egyptians, the fate of everything depended on keeping godhood concentrated within these carefully maintained bloodlines, choosing a great royal wife. The morning light filters through palace corridors as we enter the most delicate calculation in ancient Egypt, selecting the woman who would sit beside the pharaoh as his primary queen. This wasn't about romance or political alliances, though those mattered too. This was about preserving something far more precious than gold or territory, the divine essence that flowed through royal blood, keeping Egypt balanced between heaven and earth. Picture the palace advisors gathering in chambers lit by oil lamps, their voices low as they discuss bloodlines like genealogists mapping the stars. The great royal wife held a title that transcended mere queenship. She was the divine consort, the earthly Isis to the pharaoh's Horus. Her children would inherit not just a throne but godhood itself. Every decision about her selection rippled through eternity, affecting the cosmic order that kept the Nile flowing and the sun rising. The ideal candidate walked the palace halls already. The pharaoh's full sister, born to the previous king and his great royal wife. In their minds, this created the purest possible continuation of divine blood, like mixing sunlight with sunlight rather than diluting it with shadow. If you grew up in these golden corridors, breathing incense and hearing prayers to your divine father, marrying your brother felt as natural as succession itself. When no full sister existed, the search widened to half-sisters, daughters of the pharaoh's father. But different mothers. These women still carried the divine spark, though slightly diluted. Palace records show careful deliberation over these choices, weighing bloodline purity against political advantages. A half-sister with strong family connections might serve Egypt better than a full sister who brought no additional alliances. Still, divine blood trumped almost every other consideration in these calculations. In rare cases when no sisters existed at all, the selection expanded to cousins or high-ranking noblewomen. These marriages required elaborate theological justifications. Priests had to craft narratives explaining how this union maintained divine purity despite the distant bloodline. Palace scribes worked overtime, creating inscriptions that emphasized the woman's noble ancestry, her connection to goddesses, any divine dreams or omens that supported the match. Compromise demanded creative storytelling. The 18th dynasty provides perfect examples of this system in action. Around 1550 BCE, Ahmose I married his sister Ahmose Nefertari, setting a pattern that would echo through generations. Their son Amenhotep I continued the tradition by likely marrying his sister Ahmose Meritamunun. Ahmose I followed the same path with his sister Ahmose. These weren't isolated decisions but part of a calculated dynasty-building strategy spanning centuries. Each marriage reinforced their divine legitimacy. Palace life revolved around these bloodline calculations in ways that would seem incomprehensible today. Young royal children grew up knowing their marriage options were predetermined by theology rather than affection. Sisters understood they might become queens, brothers knew they might rule, all while maintaining family relationships that transcended typical sibling bonds. Imagine dinner conversations where your sister might also be your future wife, your brother, your potential pharaoh. The selection process involved palace officials, who specialized in royal genealogy, maintaining detailed records of bloodlines stretching back generations. These men could trace divine essence through family trees like priests reading sacred texts. They calculated which union would produce the most spiritually pure children, balancing theological perfection with practical politics. Their recommendations shaped Egypt's future, determining who would carry godhood into the next generation through careful matrimonial mathematics. Religious ceremonies surrounded these selections, with priests consulting oracles and interpreting dreams for divine approval. The gods themselves seemed to participate in choosing royal wives through carefully observed omens, a favorable wind during certain rituals, the behavior of sacred animals, patterns in temple smoke. Palace records describe elaborate ceremonies where potential wives were presented to various deities, seeking cosmic endorsement for their suitability as divine consorts and future mothers of gods. Once selected, the great royal wife underwent transformation rituals that elevated her from royal daughter to divine consort. She received new titles, new jewelry, new apartments within the palace complex. Temple artists carved her image alongside gods, emphasizing her elevated status. Her children would be born not just as princes and princesses, but as living deities. The weight of cosmic responsibility settled on her shoulders the moment her selection was announced through palace proclamations. The stringent standards applied to these selections reveal how seriously Egyptians took divine bloodline preservation. No detail was too small for consideration. The woman's health, her fertility signs, her behavior in religious ceremonies, even her dreams. Palace physicians examined potential wives for signs of divine favor or disfavor. Priests observed their participation in religious rituals, looking for evidence of spiritual connection with the gods. Everything mattered when choosing the mother of future deities. Competition among potential wives, when multiple sisters existed, played out in palace corridors through subtle politics and religious devotion displays. Sisters might spend extra time in temple services, demonstrating their spiritual fitness. They commissioned jewelry and artwork emphasizing their divine connections, hoping to catch royal attention. Palace intrigue swirled around these selections, with different noble families supporting different candidates, understanding that their choice would determine Egypt's political landscape for decades. Foreign observers often struggled to understand Egyptian royal marriage customs, finding the sibling unions disturbing or incomprehensible. Diplomatic records show confusion from Mesopotamian and Mediterranean rulers who practiced different marriage traditions. Yet Egyptian confidence in their system never wavered. They believed other cultures simply didn't understand divine bloodline requirements. To them, foreign criticism proved these outsiders lacked proper theological knowledge about maintaining cosmic balance through careful breeding. The great royal wife's role extended far beyond producing heirs. She participated in religious ceremonies, managed palace female hierarchies, and served as the pharaoh's divine counterpart in public appearances. Temple walls show her standing beside the king during important rituals, emphasizing her equal divine status. She wasn't just married to a god, she became a goddess herself, responsible for maintaining cosmic balance through her very existence and the purity of her bloodline. Documentation from palace archives reveals the meticulous care taken in announcing these selections throughout Egypt. Royal messengers carried news of the chosen great royal wife to every temple, ensuring priests could update their prayers and ceremonies accordingly. Scribes carved her name into temple walls alongside the pharaohs, making their divine union permanent in stone. These announcements reinforced the theological importance of the selection, reminding all Egyptians of their ruler's divine nature. Understanding these stringent selection standards illuminates the profound weight Egyptians placed on bloodline purity and divine legitimacy. The great royal wife wasn't chosen for love or even political advantage alone. She was selected as the vessel for continuing godhood on earth. Every decision, from theological consultations to ceremonial presentations, reinforced the belief that Egypt's cosmic stability depended on maintaining the purest possible divine bloodline through these carefully calculated marriages that shaped eternity itself. The pharaohs knew something was wrong. Palace physicians whispered about deformed children, about royal babies who couldn't walk properly, who struggled to speak clearly. They saw the club feet, the cleft palates, the early deaths that plagued their divine bloodlines, yet they continued marrying their sisters, their daughters, their closest relatives. Why? Because in their minds a physically broken god was still infinitely more valuable than a healthy human. Divine blood mattered more than functioning bodies. Tutankhamun represents the most famous consequence of this sacred obsession. Born around 1341 BCE, he was the product of a brother-sister union, likely between Akhenaten and an unnamed sister wife. DNA testing in 2010 confirmed what archaeologists had long suspected. His parents shared the same mother and father. The boy king inherited their divine legitimacy, along with a constellation of genetic defects that would define his short, painful life. When Tutankhamun's mummy was finally unwrapped in 1925, the evidence was unmistakable. His left foot was severely deformed, a clubfoot that would have made walking excruciating. His skull showed signs of a cleft palate. He had feminine hips, an overbite, and a slightly elongated skull. Over 130 walking sticks were found in his tomb, not ceremonial staffs, but actual mobility aids. The Golden Pharaoh needed help to walk across his own palace floors. Modern medical analysis reveals the full scope of Tutankhamun's genetic inheritance. He had a severe overbite that would have affected his speech. His spine curved unnaturally. One shoulder sat higher than the other. Geneticists have identified markers suggesting he suffered from temporal lobe epilepsy, possibly explaining the mystical experiences that some interpreted as divine visions. Every deformity was a direct result of his parents' shared bloodline, yet no one questioned the marriage that created him. The boy king's marriage followed the same destructive pattern. At age 9, he married his half-sister Ankhesenamun, daughter of Akhenaten and Nefertiti. She was probably around 13 when they wed. Their 2 daughters were stillborn, both showing signs of genetic abnormalities that made survival impossible. The couple's tomb paintings show them in tender poses, but their relationship was built on the same theological foundation that had already damaged both their bloodlines. Egyptian physicians weren't ignorant about heredity. Papyrus texts describe their understanding of how traits passed from parents to children. They knew that close breeding produced weak offspring. They saw it in their livestock, their hunting animals. Yet when it came to royalty, they applied a completely different logic. Divine blood operated by divine rules. Physical weakness in a god was acceptable, even expected. Perfection would have been suspiciously human. The contrast with non-royal marriages was stark and intentional. Common Egyptians married based on practical considerations, economic alliances, shared labor, genuine affection. They avoided close relatives not from taboo, but from observed consequences. Farmers knew that breeding sisters and brothers produced weaker animals, but pharaohs existed in a separate category, divine beings following divine patterns. Their marriages weren't about producing healthy children, but maintaining cosmic order through pure bloodlines. This created Egypt's two-tier marriage system. Sacred unions within the royal family preserved divinity, but often produced sickly heirs. Political marriages with foreign princesses or high-ranking nobles strengthened diplomatic ties but risked theological contamination. Pharaohs like Ramesses II managed both, marrying his sister for legitimacy while maintaining harems of foreign wives for politics. The great royal wife carried divine blood. Secondary wives carried practical benefits. Neither role was about love. Palace records reveal the careful management of these genetic disasters. When royal children were born with severe deformities, priests developed theological explanations rather than questioning the marriage system. A prince born blind was gifted with divine sight. A princess with a withered arm possessed spiritual strength beyond mortal understanding. Every disability became a sign of otherworldly power, proof that these children belonged to the realm of gods, not humans. The persistence of these marriages reveals something profound about belief systems. Egyptians valued ideological purity over biological health, with stunning consistency. They watched generation after generation of pharaohs struggle with genetic disorders, club feet, cleft palates, seizure disorders, early deaths, yet never connected these problems to their marriage practices. The system's theological foundation was too strong to be shaken by mere physical evidence. Divine logic trumped biological reality. Even when foreign rulers expressed horror at Egyptian practices, the pharaohs remained unmoved. Hittite kings wrote diplomatic letters, questioning the wisdom of brother-sister marriages. Mesopotamian rulers offered their own daughters as alternatives to sibling wives. But Egyptians interpreted this criticism as proof of their own superiority. Other nations simply didn't understand the divine nature of true kingship. Only Egypt possessed the theological sophistication to maintain godhood through bloodline purity. The practice persisted even as dynasties crumbled from genetic weakness. The 18th dynasty produced Tutankhamun's premature death and ended in succession crises partly caused by the lack of healthy heirs. The 19th dynasty struggled with similar problems. Yet instead of questioning sibling marriage, Egyptians blamed external forces, foreign invasions, priestly rebellions, divine displeasure. They never saw the connection between their marriage customs and dynastic instability. The theological framework was unshakable. Archaeological evidence shows the physical toll more clearly than ancient texts. Royal mummies display the accumulated damage of 3,000 years of inbreeding, shortened lifespans, frequent birth defects, evidence of genetic disorders that modern medicine can now identify. Tutankhamun died at 19. Amenhotep II suffered from severe arthritis in his 20s. Multiple pharaohs show signs of hereditary conditions that would have caused chronic pain. Their golden masks hid broken bodies. Yet the system's theological logic remained internally consistent. If pharaohs were living gods, then their physical suffering carried spiritual significance. Pain became a form of divine trial. Early death proved that these rulers belonged more to the celestial realm than the earthly one. Every genetic defect was reframed as evidence of otherworldly nature. The worse their health problems became, the more their divinity seemed confirmed. Suffering itself became sacred. This practice of perseverance reveals the power of ideology to override biological instinct. For 3 millennia, Egyptians chose divine legitimacy over genetic health. They watched their god-kings struggle with deformities, pain, and early death, yet never questioned the marriage system that caused these problems. Their commitment to theological purity was absolute. Physical reality bent to accommodate religious necessity. Belief proved stronger than biology, generation after generation. As you settle towards sleep tonight, consider the extraordinary power of conviction. Egyptians faced overwhelming evidence that their royal marriage practices produced suffering, yet they persisted because their worldview demanded it. They chose cosmic order over human health, divine purity over biological wisdom. In their minds, the universe itself depended on keeping godhood in the family. Sometimes the most devastating consequences come not from evil intentions, but from absolute certainty in sacred principles, perspectives and criticisms. Not everyone accepted royal sibling marriage without question. Even in ancient Egypt, whispers followed pharaohs through palace corridors. Women bore the burden of this system differently than men, carrying children who might never take their first breath, or watching healthy infants slowly weaken from inherited ailments. The queens knew something outsiders could only guess at. Their letters, tomb inscriptions and personal effects tell stories the official records preferred to ignore. Hatshepsut understood the game better than most. When she married her half-brother Thutmose II, she wasn't just becoming queen, she was positioning herself within a divine chess match, where bloodline determined everything. After his early death, rather than fade into the background as regent, she seized the throne entirely. Her coronation inscriptions are fascinating. She claimed direct divine parentage. The god Amun himself had chosen her mother, making her rule not just legitimate, but inevitable. The female perspective on these marriages reveals layers history often overlooks. Royal women weren't passive participants. They understood the power dynamics, the theological necessity, the political calculations. Some letters survive from queens discussing their children's health, their worries about genetic weakness, their prayers to Hathor for stronger heirs. These weren't romantic unions. They were divine duties performed by women who knew exactly what they were sacrificing for cosmic order. Modern Egyptologists have fought fierce academic battles over these marriages. Some scholars argue that sister was simply an honorific term for wife. In many cases, that royal propaganda exaggerated blood relationships to enhance legitimacy. They point to linguistic ambiguities, ceremonial titles that might not reflect biological reality. For decades, this debate raged through universities and conferences. Were these marriages literal incest, or elaborate theological theatre designed to maintain divine mystique? Then DNA testing arrived, and the arguments largely ended. The mummy, known as the Younger Lady from Tomb KV35, was genetically identified as both sister and wife to Akhenaten. Tutankhamun's parents were confirmed as full siblings. The evidence became undeniable. These weren't ceremonial relationships or political fiction. They were biological siblings producing children together, generation after generation for 3,000 years. The critics had been wrong. The marriages were exactly what they appeared to be. Non-royal Egyptians viewed these marriages with a complex mixture of reverence and distance. Common people understood that pharaohs operated by different rules, divine rules that didn't apply to ordinary families. Farmers and craftsmen might marry cousins occasionally, but sibling marriage remained the exclusive domain of gods walking among mortals. It reinforced the fundamental separation between divine royalty and human subjects. They weren't meant to understand it completely, only to accept it as proof of their ruler's otherworldly nature. Foreign reactions ranged from curiosity to horror. Mesopotamian kings, accustomed to political marriages across kingdoms, found Egyptian customs strange but manageable. They could work around theological differences for trade agreements and military alliances. The Hittites practiced adoptive brother-sister marriages in their royal family, so they understood the concept of keeping power concentrated. But when Greeks encountered Egyptian royal marriage customs, their reaction was immediate disgust. They considered it barbaric incest, proof that Egyptians, despite their impressive monuments, were fundamentally uncivilized. The Ptolemaic dynasty perfectly illustrates this cultural clash. These Macedonian Greeks initially avoided sibling marriage after Alexander conquered Egypt. They found the practice repugnant, preferring traditional Greek marriage customs. But as decades passed, they realized that Egyptians would never fully accept foreign rulers who didn't follow divine protocols. By Cleopatra's time, the Ptolemies had adopted sibling marriage complete, though Cleopatra herself likely never consummated her marriages to her brothers, having them murdered instead. The medical consequences were impossible to ignore, even for true believers. Royal physicians documented birth defects, infant mortality, and developmental problems with clinical precision. They knew sibling marriage produced weaker children. Palace records hint at private conversations where doctors advised pharaohs to choose different wives, recommendations that were politely ignored. Divine protocol outweighed medical wisdom every time. The gods required pure bloodlines, regardless of the physical cost to individual children. Some queens found subtle ways to work around the system. They might bear children to multiple pharaohs, creating complex family trees where half-siblings from different fathers married each other, slightly reducing genetic concentration while maintaining theological legitimacy. Others focused on producing many children, hoping some would survive the genetic lottery. A few, like Hatshepsut, bypassed the system entirely by claiming direct divine parentage that transcended normal bloodline requirements. Critics within Egypt were rare but not non-existent. Some priests questioned whether the gods truly required such strict interpretation of divine marriage. A few medical papyri suggest physicians understood the connection between close breeding and weak offspring. But open criticism was dangerous. Questioning royal marriage customs meant questioning the pharaoh's divine nature, which bordered on blasphemy. Most doubts were expressed privately, in letters between trusted friends, or buried in medical texts disguised as general health observations. The practice created fascinating power dynamics between queens and secondary wives. The great royal wife held supreme status because of her bloodline, not her personality or political skill. But secondary wives, often foreign princesses or noble daughters, sometimes wielded considerable influence through their children or their family connections. This created tension in royal harems, where divine bloodline competed with political usefulness, beauty, and personal charisma for the pharaoh's attention and succession planning. Archaeological evidence suggests some couples genuinely cared for each other despite the arranged nature of their marriages. Tomb paintings show pharaohs and sister wives in affectionate poses, sharing intimate moments, participating in religious ceremonies together. Letters between some royal couples contain expressions of concern during illness, joy at successful births, grief at losses. Love could grow even within theological arrangements, though whether this was genuine affection or performative propaganda remains debatable. The economic implications were staggering. Royal marriages concentrated enormous wealth within tiny family circles. Sister wives brought no external dowries or foreign alliances. Their value was purely theological. This meant Egyptian royal resources stayed completely internal, never distributed to foreign powers through marriage settlements. Other civilizations gained wealth through strategic marriages to Egyptian royalty, but Egypt gained little except divine legitimacy. The practice was economically inefficient, but theologically essential. Modern genetic studies reveal the true cost of this 3,000-year experiment. Royal mummies show accumulated genetic damage that would have continued worsening with each generation. Tutankhamun represents the near endpoint of this process, so genetically compromised he could barely walk, likely sterile, dying at 19. If Egypt hadn't fallen to foreign conquest, their royal line might have bred itself into complete extinction. Divine purity had become divine weakness. The perspectives on royal sibling marriage were as complex as the practice itself. Women navigated impossible choices between personal happiness and cosmic duty. Scholars debated biological reality versus ceremonial fiction. Egyptians revered what foreigners condemned. Doctors documented consequences that pharaohs ignored. In the end, every perspective revealed the same truth, that belief systems powerful enough can override even the strongest biological instincts, for better or worse, for 3,000 years. The ripple effects of 3,000 years of royal sibling marriage weren't contained within palace walls. They spread through Egyptian society like cracks in temple stone, slowly, inevitably, reshaping everything they touched. The practice that preserved divine bloodlines also created political chaos that would echo across centuries, touching civilizations Egypt would never see. By the late period, the genetic consequences were impossible to ignore. Royal children arrived stillborn at alarming rates. Those who survived often carried visible deformities, cleft palates, misshapen limbs, developmental delays that made ruling nearly impossible. Yet the theological machinery kept grinding forward, producing increasingly fragile heirs to an eternal throne. Succession crises became Egypt's chronic illness. When Tutankhamun died at 19 without an heir, the dynasty crumbled. His widow Ankhesenamun, his half-sister and wife, desperately wrote to the Hittite king, begging for one of his sons as a husband. The letter still exists, raw with panic and political calculation. The Hittite prince she requested was murdered on his way to Egypt. Political chaos followed. General Horemheb seized the throne, ending the royal bloodline entirely. This wasn't unusual, it was the pattern. Weak heirs meant military coups, foreign invasions, periods where Egypt's god-kings were anything but Egyptian. Yet ordinary Egyptians never questioned the practice itself. When dynasties collapsed, they blamed insufficient piety, foreign corruption, cosmic imbalance, anything except the obvious biological reality. Their faith in divine bloodline marriage remained unshaken, even as it repeatedly destroyed the very dynasties it was meant to preserve. This devotion reveals something profound about human psychology. Egyptians were brilliant engineers, skilled physicians, careful astronomers. They understood cause and effect in every realm except this one. Religious belief created a blind spot so complete that evidence couldn't penetrate it. The gods had married siblings, so pharaohs must too. The practice spread beyond Egypt's borders, through conquest and cultural influence. When Alexander's general Ptolemy established his dynasty in Alexandria, his descendants initially followed Greek marriage customs, but within generations they'd adopted full Egyptian sibling marriage. Royal blood, they learned, demanded purity regardless of cultural background. The Ptolemies took sibling marriage to even greater extremes than native pharaohs. Cleopatra VII descended from at least 6 generations of brother-sister marriages. Her family tree looks more like a straight line, yet she was brilliant, charismatic, politically astute, proof that genetic damage wasn't always immediately visible. Halfway across the world, the Inca Empire developed remarkably similar practices independently. The Sapa Inca married his full sister, the Koya, to maintain solar divinity. Their reasoning mirrors Egypt's exactly: gods married siblings, so god kings must follow suit. This parallel evolution suggests something deeper about power and purity. Hawaiian Ali'i chiefs practiced sibling marriage to preserve sacred manna. European observers were horrified, but the logic was identical to Egypt's. Divine power resided in bloodlines, and dilution meant cosmic disaster. Geography didn't matter. The impulse to keep godhood in the family appeared wherever rulers claimed divine status. Even cultures that rejected sibling marriage absorbed Egypt's obsession with bloodline purity. Medieval European royalty developed elaborate genealogies proving descent from Charlemagne or Caesar. Marriage became diplomatic chess, with bloodline compatibility trumping personal choice. Egypt's shadow stretched across centuries it never witnessed. Modern royal families still echo these ancient anxieties. When Prince William married Catherine Middleton, genealogists traced her lineage back to minor nobility, desperate to find aristocratic blood. The language has softened, but the underlying impulse remains: royal blood must marry royal blood, even diluted by centuries. The Habsburg dynasty provides history's clearest example of what happens when European royalty follows Egyptian logic too closely. Generations of cousin marriages produced Charles II of Spain, so genetically damaged he couldn't chew food properly. His death ended the Spanish Habsburg line entirely, Egypt's pattern repeating in different centuries. Yet the fascination with royal bloodlines persists in popular culture. Millions follow modern royal weddings with the same intensity ancient Egyptians reserved for pharaonic ceremonies. We've replaced divine blood with celebrity mystique, but the psychological appeal remains identical. Some families are simply different, special, worthy of preservation. The scientific revolution finally broke Egypt's ancient spell. When Mendel discovered inheritance laws and Darwin explained genetic variation, the biological costs of inbreeding became undeniable. Royal families quietly abandoned cousin marriages, though they kept the language of bloodline purity. Knowledge, at last, trumped tradition. Egypt's legacy isn't just pyramids and hieroglyphs. It's the idea that some bloodlines carry divinity. That power flows through genetics. That marriage is too important for personal choice. 3,000 years of sibling marriages left invisible monuments in our collective unconscious. The persistent belief that blood, somehow, makes certain families sacred. A reflection on divine love. Tonight, we reach the heart of something profound. The moment when love becomes larger than biology. When duty transcends desire. For 3,000 years, Egyptian pharaohs chose theology over genetics, divinity over health. They watched their children suffer from the consequences of close marriages, yet never wavered. This wasn't ignorance, it was faith, so complete it overrode every natural instinct. Think about the incredible power of belief. Imagine loving something so deeply that you'd sacrifice your own children's health for it. Egyptian royals saw their babies born with deformities, watched young heirs die before their time, witnessed the physical toll of sibling marriage, and still continued. Because in their minds they weren't just preserving bloodlines, they were maintaining the very fabric of existence itself. The royal nurseries must have been heartbreaking places. Tutankhamun's club foot, his cleft palate, his early death at 19, these weren't mysteries to ancient physicians. They could see the pattern. Royal children were weaker, sicker, more likely to die young. Yet the practice continued because what they were preserving wasn't human, it was divine. Every deformed prince was still a living god. This is where divine love becomes almost incomprehensible to modern minds. We prioritize individual happiness, personal choice, biological health. But Egyptian royals were playing a different game entirely. They believed their marriages maintained cosmic balance itself. A healthy commoner child meant nothing compared to a sickly but divinely pure heir who could keep the universe stable. Consider the weight these pharaohs carried. They weren't choosing wives, they were choosing the fate of creation. In their theology, if divine bloodline became diluted, the gods might abandon Egypt, the Nile might stop flooding, the sun might not rise. Every marriage was literally a matter of universal survival. No wonder they ignored the genetic evidence right before their eyes. The paradox cuts deeper than we first imagined. These weren't primitive people making ignorant choices. Egyptian medicine was remarkably advanced. They performed surgery, understood anatomy, recognized hereditary conditions. They knew what sibling marriage was doing to their children. They chose divine purity over biological health, with full knowledge of the consequences. That's the power of absolute faith. Picture a young pharaoh, maybe 18, being told he must marry his sister. Maybe he loves someone else. Maybe he sees how sickly his cousins are, products of similar unions, but duty calls louder than desire. His advisors remind him, "You're not just a man, you're Horus incarnate. Your marriage isn't about happiness, it's about keeping the gods content." The royal women lived this paradox too. Hatshepsut, brilliant and ambitious, married her half-brother as expected, but when widowed, she seized power for herself, understanding the system perfectly. If divine bloodline was everything, then her blood was just as divine as any man's. She used the same logic that trapped other royal women to liberate herself. Foreign rulers watched this practice with fascination and horror. Greek kings found it barbaric. Roman leaders considered it primitive. Yet Egypt remained powerful for millennia, while other empires rose and fell. Their system worked, not because it was biologically sound, but because it created unshakable legitimacy. No one could question a pharaoh's divine right when his bloodline was pure. This is divine love, at its most extreme, love of gods, of cosmic order, of universal stability. So complete it eclipses every human concern. Egyptian royals loved their deities more than they loved their own children's health. They loved Ma'at more than they loved themselves. It's terrifying and beautiful, and utterly foreign to our modern sensibilities. The system's internal logic was flawless. If pharaohs were gods, they should behave like gods. The myth of Osiris and Isis, divine siblings and spouses, provided the perfect template. Every royal marriage was cosmic theatre, reenacting the divine romance that created order from chaos. They weren't copying human behavior, they were modeling divine behavior. But here's what strikes me most: the absolute certainty. Egyptian royals never seemed to doubt their system, never questioned whether the gods actually required sibling marriage. They built a civilization on this foundation, and defended it for 3,000 years. That level of collective faith, regardless of consequences, is almost impossible to imagine in our skeptical age. Think about practices in your own culture that might seem strange to outsiders. Things you do because they're simply how things are done. Traditions so embedded you never question them. Egyptian royal marriage reminds us how powerfully culture shapes what seems natural, necessary, or even moral. Context changes everything, including what we call love. The end came gradually. Greek influence, Roman conquest, changing religious beliefs. Eventually the old certainties crumbled. Cleopatra was the last pharaoh to marry her brother, and even she did it for political theatre rather than genuine belief. The divine bloodlines finally ended, not through biological collapse, but through cultural transformation. As we close this exploration, remember that Egyptian royal marriage wasn't really about human love at all. It was about something larger, cosmic love, divine love, the kind of transcendent devotion that makes ordinary concerns disappear. They sacrificed individual happiness for universal harmony. Whether that was noble or tragic depends entirely on your perspective. Rest tonight, knowing that love takes countless forms across cultures and centuries. The pharaohs chose divine love over human love, cosmic order over personal desire. Their story reminds us that what seems obvious to one society can seem impossible to another. Sweet dreams, free from the burden of maintaining universal balance through your marriage choices.